Hi guys, we are now on video 2 for chapter 9. We're going to be looking at the three states of the economy. We're going to begin with a state of equilibrium. I love this beautifully balanced image because it reminds us of what equilibrium is. Equilibrium means nothing is over, nothing is under. Quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Of course, in this case, it's total real GDP purchased, purchases equal total production. Real GDP purchased equals real GDP provided or produced. So let's look at this a little bit. What do we have here? We have a graph where the price level goes on Y. This is the first variable. So when I ask you to identify variables for curves, I'm always asking you to pay attention to how the axes are labeled. On Y, you have the price level, not the price. That would be just demand and supply. This is the price level because you're dealing with aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The word aggregate means total again. What's down here on X is the GDP. It's the real GDP. Now, where they intersect, this is our aggregate supply curve in the short term. You know it's the short term because it doesn't say long run. Like, see how up here it says long run aggregate supply curve? This one that is rather upsloping shows us that the higher the price level, the higher the production. This is our aggregate demand curve. It's downsloping. It's showing us the higher the price level, the less the economy is buying in total. And this is the long run aggregate supply, and notice it's vertical because it's an independent curve. It shows us that the only thing that matters in this graph is the quantity down here, which is the real GDP, be it purchased or produced, at this point right here, at this point in time. So when the long run aggregate supply curve happens to intersect where the short run aggregate supply and the short run aggregate demand curve overlap right here and they form this perfect intersection, this is known as equilibrium or the natural real GDP. You know what? I'm gonna add that. The natural real GDP. And sometimes you might have heard that, right? You might actually have heard that. You definitely are reading it in your textbook. You're reading it in the outlines or in the exercises or homework. So state of equilibrium is the same as the natural real GDP. This is our state of perfection. Of course, the economy isn't always going to be in a state of perfection because things don't work that way. So now we're going to be looking at the recessionary state. The recessionary state is a state of surplus. It means we have too much inventory we're not able to move. We don't have enough buying in the economy, therefore the inventory is lingering. And so instead of having those beautiful balanced rocks, I wanted to share with you something where we're deducting from the economy. And it's pretty precarious. You can tell this is not going to stay straight like that. These rocks are tumbling down. In a recessionary state, here's basically what you have going on. You have a reduction in total production. You have a reduction in employment. We have less consumption. We have less investments and profits. Real estate values suffer. Job creation becomes an issue. Innovation suffers. Do you see what's happening here? It's a plummeting of some sort. Think of what a receding hairline is. Hair goes back. Nobody wants that. But what it means is less and falling back and falling behind. This is an economy that is underperforming. And so if we look at this graph together here, if you recall, when we were looking at the equilibrium, real GDP, this is the long run aggregate supply curve, the blue curve right here. It would have been right in the middle here, intersecting with the short run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate demand curve. Instead, where are the aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve intersecting? Short of where it should be. Our potential, where the equilibrium is, where the happy place is this blue long run aggregate supply curve. Instead, the economy is underperforming by this much. So if right here where the blue curve, hits the x-axis is, let's say, $25 trillion, and the economy is here at 23 trillion, then the economy where the intersection would be, it would be short $2 trillion. This is what that means. It means an economy is underperforming by this value here, the difference between the value here and the value here. So if this is 25 trillion and this is 23 trillion, 25 minus 23 is 2, there would be a deflationary, although it's more common to say it is a negative gap or frankly a recessionary gap of 2 trillion. So again, what's a recessionary gap? Everything is going in the wrong direction, except maybe for inflation. And maybe we should put that here. Inflation also eases into disinflation, most likely. Okay, I'll put down most likely. You're looking at a disinflationary state. And what is a disinflationary state, if you recall? It means the rate of inflation is slowing down. So everything is going backwards and prices are cooling off too, because there isn't as much buying in an economy and there isn't as much friction, there isn't as much production going on in the economy. This is recessionary. We luckily have not had a recessionary state in a very long time. And right now, today is August 10th, and we just had a release of how many jobs we added, and we added a whopping 528,000 jobs, which was a massive surprise, and inflation on top of it in July, all this information is like right on the dot, was flat. So even though inflation jumped up 9.1% from May to June, from June to July, it was actually flat. So maybe we are putting that inflation behind us. 1 month is too soon to call anything. It's not a trend, but it gives us an idea. And so are we in a recession? Absolutely not. We haven't had a recession basically since the Great Recession. And then the economy just kept moving and chugging along and improving, which is basically since 2008, 2009. We have been in a very good upswing. And so the opposite of recessionary. In our third market state, or in this case, the economy, the state of the economy, we're looking at an inflationary state. Inflationary comes obviously from inflation. So what's happening here is that if you think of inflating a balloon, you're always making it bigger. Those are really wonderful images to have in your mind. What we are looking at here is the complete opposite of recessionary. What's total production doing? It's going up. See the arrow up? Employment is increasing, consumption is increasing, investments and profits are on the rise, real estate is recovering, so the value of your home or the value of buildings is actually going up. Job creation is back on the table, innovation is striding forward, and we also have, though we don't love it, but it comes with the territory, is inflation. And if you look at this image here, this cairn, these are called cairns if you don't know, it's a Scottish word, Celtic word originally. And if you notice that the rocks are piling up and they're balancing and they're growing, but notice how they're a little bit precarious, which means at some point you're going to add one too many stones or one too many rocks and everything is going to come tumbling down, at least the top few. That's because eventually the one too many stones is inflation. We add too much inflation and we lose this beautiful balance that's happening in here. Now graphically, let's look at this graph first. Here's what's happening in this graph. The variables are the same. You have the price level on the Y, you have the real GDP on the X. This is where the long-run aggregate supply curve. So if this were a state of equilibrium, the short-run aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve would be meeting right on top. This intersection right here would happen right on top of the long-run aggregate supply curve. It's not doing that, right? Instead, they are intersecting past it. So if we're looking at 25 trillion for equilibrium, and this over here, let's say, is 28 trillion, then this would be an economy that's overheating by 3 trillions worth. Because it's a positive gap, it's an overdoing it, we are overproducing past the potential by 3 trillion. And you might be saying, why is this a bad thing? It's not a bad thing so long inflation is not out of control. But the odds are you do this long enough, inflation will become out of control. When inflation is out of control, people begin to apply the brakes, right? We say, oh my God, everything is so expensive. You cut back on your spending. And then that hurts businesses' bottom lines. Businesses start to lay people off, and very rapidly. We're not in a recession right now, and I'm sure you have heard multiple companies, including Tesla, for instance, or Bank of America, or reporting that they are laying people off. They're jumping the gun And that can manifest a recession we don't really have to manifest. This is one of the things I wish would be different about the economy, that businesses are so quick to let go of people and very slow to hire them back. But the point is that an inflationary state is okay so long it doesn't bring with it inflation, and it will sooner or later. Now, if you look at this graph above it, what I really like about this graph is it shows you how aggregate demand in this case made the economy actually shift into an inflationary state. So if you look initially at the aggregate demand curve where it was, so the aggregate supply in the short run is staying pretty, it's not doing anything. The aggregate demand was meeting it here, and then due to non-price determinants, and in this case they would be something like maybe additional employment and overall national income or average weekly income is increasing, for instance. If that's the case, then the aggregate demand shifts to the right and brings with it higher price level and brings with it also a bigger level of production and consumption. So if this is the case and you have inflation here rising too much, this would be a type of demand pull inflation, right? If you actually saw the reverse, the aggregate demand curve stayed put and the aggregate supply curve ended up shifting, for instance, in such a way as to actually cause an economy to overheat, then you would have two aggregate supply curves instead of two aggregate demand curves. But this is a state of inflation. Where are we right now? We're more in a state of inflation. We know we're having high prices. We know high prices, though, are not consequently because of too much aggregate demand. That's a portion of it. Most of it is actually aggregate supply saying my costs of production are so high, I'm going to raise the prices on you for the most part, whether it's food or rent or gas or whatever it may be. Hopefully we're beginning to see the end of that trend, but you understand where we're going with this. So in this case, looking at this, it is an inflationary state caused by too few goods being chased by too many dollars. In other words, it's demand pull inflation. And if this happens long enough and at high enough of a degree, it will actually cause a recessionary state. Okay, we're going to stop right here with this video and pick it up with a comparison and the spending multiplier.